In this video, I'm going to show you how to build a computer desk in one day. So this desk only takes one sheet of plywood to build. So what I'm doing here is actually reusing the lumber from a temporary computer desk that I built when we first moved into our house. So here I'm just trying to figure out a way to take this thing out without accidentally unplugging the internet, because we all know how bad that could be. Whoops. So now with that out of the way, I can cut my desktop down to the final dimensions that I decided on, which is 2 feet wide by 52 inches long. Next, I took the side panels from the old desk to make the legs for the new desk, cutting a total of 6 4-inch strips. How long to make the legs really depends on what your needs are ergonomically, so I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the video. I then took 2 of the 4-inch strips and I ripped them down the middle, so I ended up with 4 4-inch strips and 4 2-inch strips to use for the legs. I then used a 2 1/8 inch spacer block to lay out the overhang around the desk, and this made it really easy to get the measurements I needed for the apron pieces. For those of you who don't know, the apron is the part of the desk that adds structural support for the desktop, and it's also where the legs screw into. So unfortunately, I didn't have any material long enough to do the front and back of the apron. So what I ended up doing was cutting a third piece to act as a support in the middle, and then I did the front and back apron as 2 pieces. But to measure this out, I brought the center support that I made off to one side, then put the other side support on the end, and I measured the distance between them. Then I could just make all of the front and back apron pieces half of this measurement. Now that I have all of my pieces cut, I could think about assembly, and I decided to use pocket screws to attach the apron to the desktop, just because that's the easiest and quickest way to do it. I found that it was easiest to install the left side and right side apron pieces to the desktop first, and then I could install everything else in the middle after that. Now I should have really kept that spacer block that I used in the beginning of the project to make sure that I had a consistent overhang all the way around the desk, but unfortunately I threw that in the trash, so I just had to use my tape measure instead. So now here you can see me attaching all of the apron pieces to the desktop, but one thing I should have done here was attach the front and back apron pieces to that center support piece as well. I didn't do that, and it would have added a lot of stability, so at some point in the future I am going to go back and do that. To assemble the legs, I simply took one of the 4-inch strips and one of the 2-inch strips, and I glued them together to make like an L shape. And I used brad nails to hold them together simply because I don't have enough clamps to do glue ups for all 4 of the legs. To install the legs, first I used a few brad nails to hold it in place, and then from the inside I drove in 2 1/4 inch screws. My son was happy to help out on this one because he loves to glue things. Now, as I was finishing up assembly of the desk, we got a delivery, and my dog really didn't know what to make of it. What, you don't like my hitch spot? Now, with assembly finished, all there was left to do was sand and paint. So earlier in the video, I said I would briefly talk about ergonomics at the end of this video, so you can use that to figure out how tall your desk needs to be. Now, I'm not an expert at it or anything, but I have a few guidelines that I used to figure out how tall to make this desk. The first thing you want to do is you want to get your chair to the right height, and the way you do that is you make sure your feet are flat on the floor and that your knees are bent at either 90 degrees or a little bit more than 90. And then you want your armrests to be at a height so that your arms can rest at 90 degrees on the armrests. And then you also want your keyboard to be at about the same height as your armrests are. And then lastly, you want to sit up straight, of course, and you want the monitor, the top of the monitor should be about even with your eyes. So those are some guidelines that you can use to figure out how tall your desk should be. So what I did was I determined how tall my desk needs to be so that the keyboard is sitting at the right height, because everything else I can adjust around that. So I think trying to figure out the right height for your keyboard is probably a good place to start. So the reason why I don't just give you the measurements that I used for my desk is because I'm assuming you don't have a sit-stand station. So that's going to change how tall your desk needs to be. I specifically made this one 6 inches shorter than I made the previous one because I was actually starting to get a sore back because everything was too tall. So my desk is probably shorter than yours is going to be. So, but I think if you use those guidelines that I mentioned earlier, you should be able to figure out a good height for your desk. So I hope you found this useful. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.